The dinner table was full that night in Makola Heights, but Adissa could hardly taste his food. His uncle's sudden anger broke the silence when he slapped an eviction notice on the table. The words cut sharper than the paper, "You have 30 days to leave. This is not charity." Adissa froze, his spoon trembling in his hand. His cousins laughed under their breath, enjoying his shame, while his aunt avoided his eyes as if she agreed. No reason was given except that he was not contributing, as if the years he spent respecting their rules meant nothing. The humiliation burned inside him, but he swallowed it without a word. After dinner, he walked quietly to his small corner of the house. He folded his few clothes, tucked away his books, and placed everything into a worn bag that was barely half full. Every sound felt heavier than usual, the zipper closing, the chair scraping, the footsteps on the floor. His uncle and cousins kept watching, waiting for him to beg, but he never did. He only lifted the bag over his shoulder, his face calm but his eyes sharp with fire. As he stepped out into the night, the lights of the city flickered in the distance. The house that once gave him shelter now pushed him out, but he did not let it break him. He left without shouting or tears, carrying nothing but a small bag and a quiet promise to himself: this would not be his end. It would be his beginning. Adissa walked through the crowded streets of Makola Heights with no place to call home. That first night after leaving his uncle's house, he sat in a noisy internet cafe, pretending to be a customer while trying to stay awake so no one would throw him out. The bright screens and buzzing machines kept him company, but deep inside, his aunt's voice would not leave his head: "You'll never make it without us." Those words stung, but instead of breaking him, they became fuel. Every time he felt tired or hungry, he repeated them to himself, not as a curse but as a challenge. When he had a few coins, he paid for a few hours online, searching for work. He tried everything: writing short articles, helping students with schoolwork, even translating small documents. Some nights he made only enough for food, other nights, nothing at all. But he never stopped. When cafes closed, he would slip into the empty stalls of Makola Market, lying on a cardboard sheet, staring up at the neon lights that flickered from the street. The cold air bit into his skin, but he told himself, "This is my classroom, this is where I learn to fight." At dawn, before shop owners arrived, Adissa hustled to earn a little more. He carried goods for traders, flipped second-hand items, and sold cheap phone accessories he bought in bulk. The city that once pushed him out now became his training ground. Every insult, every sleepless night, every empty stomach made him sharper, stronger, and hungrier for success. He stopped thinking of himself as a victim and started thinking like a survivor. Each time he sent out a proposal online, he imagined himself walking out of the market forever. Each time he earned a small profit, he felt a spark of pride that nobody could take away. He had no roof, no family support, and no safety net, but he had something far more powerful: determination. People who passed him at night never guessed that the young man dozing in a cafe chair or stretched out on the cold floor of a market stall was building a future in silence. They saw a homeless boy. But inside, Adissa knew he was shaping into something else entirely. The sleepless nights were no longer punishment, they were fire, and he was learning how to burn without being destroyed. Adissa's days were still long and restless, but his small steps were starting to add up. One afternoon, after finishing some online tutoring, he wandered into a small co-working hub. It was nothing fancy, just a place where young hustlers and freelancers rented cheap desks with steady internet. Adissa had no money to pay, but he offered to fix broken laptops and help others with online accounts just so he could sit inside. That was where he met Mr. Tembo, a man in his late 60s with tired eyes and heavy files stacked in front of him. Unlike the sharp young freelancers, Tembo looked out of place. He was a property developer, old-fashioned and frustrated with technology. His properties sat empty for months because he didn't know how to reach tenants online. Adissa watched him struggle and saw an opportunity. He leaned over and said gently, "Sir, I can help you with this. I know how to put your listings online and handle the messages. Tembo looked at him with doubt. This young man with worn shoes and hungry eyes didn't look like much. But desperation makes confidence, and Adissa spoke with a steady tone. After a short conversation, Tembo agreed to give him a trial. That week, Adissa worked like his life depended on it, because it did. He took photos of Tembo's apartments, wrote clear listings, posted on every site he could find, and even answered late-night calls from interested tenants. Within a few weeks, empty rooms began to fill. Rent that had been delayed for months started flowing in. Tembo, who had been losing money, suddenly saw his profits grow. He could hardly believe it when his income doubled, then tripled. "Boy," Tembo said one evening, shaking his head, "you've done more for me in weeks than my staff has in years." For Adissa, it was the first time someone with power spoke to him with respect. Tembo not only paid him generously but also invited him to work closely by his side. Soon, Adissa was handling negotiations, drawing up agreements, and even advising which properties were worth buying. His sharp mind for numbers and his hunger to succeed made him invaluable. Months passed, and Tembo's trust in Adissa grew. One day, over coffee at the same co-working hub, Tembo leaned in and said, "I'm getting old. I don't need to keep everything to myself. How about we become partners?" Adissa almost dropped his cup. A partner? He had gone from sleeping on market stalls to being offered a stake in a real business. Tembo explained the plan. Together they would manage and acquire undervalued rental properties across Makola Heights. Adissa accepted with quiet gratitude, but inside his heart was racing. This was more than a job, it was the breakthrough nobody expected. The same city that threw him onto the streets was now opening its doors wide. For the first time, Adissa saw not just survival ahead of him, but the beginning of real power and freedom. Only 6 months had passed since Adissa walked out of his uncle's house with nothing but a small bag, yet it felt like a lifetime. The boy who once slept in market stalls was gone. In his place stood a young man in a neatly pressed suit, polished shoes, and a steady gaze. Every morning now, Adissa walked into offices where men twice his age shook his hand with respect. He no longer searched for internet cafes to rest, instead, he sat across shiny tables with lawyers and bankers, discussing numbers he once could only dream about. The day he signed his first major contract felt unreal. Papers were spread across the polished wooden desk of a law office, and the housing block deal was worth more than anything he had ever imagined. The pen trembled in his hand, not out of fear but out of disbelief. Just 6 months earlier, he had been treated as worthless. Now he was officially becoming a landlord in Makola Heights, the same neighborhood that once spat him out. The ink flowed smoothly as he wrote his name, sealing a future that no insult could erase. But fate had a strange twist prepared. As the lawyer went over the list of properties included in the deal, one address made Adissa pause. His eyes froze on the paper. It was his uncle's compound, the very house where he had been thrown out, humiliated in front of his cousins, told he had no place there. For a moment, Adissa sat back in silence, almost hearing his aunt's voice again, "You'll never make it without us." But now the meaning was different. He smiled to himself, realizing life had come full circle. Walking out of the office with the signed papers in his briefcase, Adissa felt both power and peace. The streets that once carried him as a wanderer now saw him as a man with purpose. He remembered the cold nights under neon lights, the hunger, the doubt, the whispers of people who thought he would fail. Every struggle had led him here, to this very moment. That evening, as he rode through Makola Heights, he passed the compound where he once lived as an unwanted guest. From outside the gate, children were playing, neighbors were gossiping, and life carried on as usual. No one inside knew that the young man they had mocked now held the papers that decided their future. Adissa didn't stop, not yet. He only looked at the house with calm eyes and whispered under his breath, "This story isn't over." In that moment, he understood something deeper. Success wasn't about revenge or proving people wrong, it was about proving himself right. The same family that tried to end his story had unknowingly set him on the path to write a greater one. And now, with contracts signed and destiny in his hands, Odessa was no longer just surviving. He was rising. The sun was heavy that Saturday, the air sticky and thick in Makola Heights. Inside the compound, Odessa's aunt was sweeping the front yard when a sharp knock came at the gate. She muttered under her breath, annoyed, and shuffled forward to see who it was. The moment she opened the gate, her eyes widened. There stood Odessa, dressed in a fine suit that fit him perfectly, his shoes shining against the dusty ground. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a legal officer holding a file, and behind them were two contractors, their tape measures and notebooks in hand. For a second, she blinked in confusion, then her face twisted into the same sneer she had worn the night she last saw him. "So, you're back to beg," she spat, her tone dripping with scorn. The cousins gathered quickly, whispering and giggling, expecting to watch him humiliated again. But Odessa only smiled calmly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't insult her, didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached into his folder, pulled out crisp legal documents, and unfolded them slowly in front of her. His voice was soft but firm as he said, "No. I'm not here to beg. I'm here as your new landlord. Your rent contract is with me now." The words fell like thunder. The cousins stopped smirking, their eyes growing wide. One of them even dropped the phone in his hand. From the doorway, his uncle appeared, his face already pale as if his body knew before his mind accepted it. "Impossible," he whispered, his lips trembling. Neighbors began to gather outside the gate, curious about the scene. They saw Odessa standing tall, the same young man who had once been thrown out with nothing but a bag, now returning with power in his hands. The aunt tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky. She snatched the papers, her hands trembling as her eyes raced over the legal stamps and signatures. Everything was real. Everything was final. Odessa stood silently, letting the weight of the truth sink in. The same family who told him he would never survive without them now had their home under his control. He didn't gloat or shout. His silence was louder than any insult. The uncle stepped closer, trying to steady himself, but his voice broke as he said, "Odessa, this can't be." His pride, once so high, was now crushed under the reality that the boy he had mocked had returned not as a beggar but as the owner of his roof. The contractors moved around the yard, measuring walls and noting repairs, while the legal officer waited for Odessa's instructions. The aunt stood frozen, the cousins stared, the neighbors whispered in awe. And Odessa, still calm, finally said, "From now on, you deal with me." With that, the knock that began as ordinary had shaken the entire household to its core. Nothing would ever be the same again. The news spread through Makola Heights faster than wildfire. By the afternoon, everyone knew that the young man once mocked as useless had returned as the owner of his uncle's compound. Inside the house, the atmosphere was heavy with silence. His aunt, who used to talk the loudest, could barely find her voice. His cousins, who once smirked at him when he packed his small bag, now kept their eyes down, afraid to meet his gaze. His uncle, who once slammed the eviction notice on the dinner table, sat stiff in his chair, his face drained of color. For the first time, the family felt the sting of being powerless, of having their fate tied to the very person they had thrown out. Neighbors gathered by the gate, whispering and pointing, unable to believe what they were seeing. The same people who had seen Odessa carrying his bag into the night 6 months earlier now watched him stand tall in a pressed suit, speaking with lawyers and contractors. Mothers shook their heads in amazement, traders muttered that life is unpredictable, and children whispered, "That's the man they called useless." Every eye was on him, and every whisper made his aunt's shame heavier. But Odessa did not shout or boast. He didn't remind them of the insults or repeat their cruel words. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Calmly, he laid down the rules, his tone steady like a man who knew his worth. "From today," he said, "this compound is under my management. You will pay rent on time, and you will respect the contract. If you fail, you vacate. It's that simple. The words cut deeper than any insult. His cousins shifted uncomfortably, their smirks long gone. His aunt opened her mouth to protest but quickly closed it, realizing she had no power to argue. His uncle, once so proud and commanding, nodded weakly, forced to acknowledge the authority of the man he once humiliated. Outside the gate, the neighbors gasped at Adissa's composure. Some nodded in respect, saying, "He didn't let anger lead him. He's stronger than them all." Others whispered that fate had humbled the household. The same family that had boasted about throwing him out now had to live under his rules, and everyone saw it happen. Adissa didn't stay long. He handed over the documents to the legal officer and gave clear instructions to the contractors about repairs. He treated it like business, not revenge. Then, without another word, he turned and left. His silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. That night, the family sat in the compound with their heads lowered. The roles had completely turned. They were no longer the ones with control, no longer the ones laughing. Respect was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. And the boy they had once dismissed as useless had become the man who now dictated whether they stayed or left. Word of Adissa's return and ownership of the compound spread far beyond the neighborhood. Within days, the story reached the ears of the extended family. His uncle, desperate to save face, called meetings and tried to rally everyone against Adissa. He shouted that Adissa had betrayed his own blood, that he had allowed pride and greed to make him forget where he came from. He painted himself as the victim, the man who had cared for his nephew only to be repaid with disrespect. But when the relatives sat down and saw the stamped legal documents in Adissa's hands, the truth was undeniable. The papers carried authority, and authority carried respect. One by one, the relatives began to shift their view. They remembered how the uncle had mocked Adissa and thrown him out without mercy. They remembered the humiliation. Now they compared that cruelty with the calm dignity Adissa showed. Instead of revenge, he set fair terms. Instead of insults, he spoke with respect. Slowly, the family began to side with him, not out of pity, but out of admiration. "This boy has worked hard," one elder said. "He has lifted himself without help. That deserves honor, not envy." Meanwhile, in Makola Heights, business owners and community leaders began to notice Adissa's rising influence. Invitations came to join meetings, to sit at tables where deals were made and futures shaped. Traders who once ignored him now leaned in to hear his opinion. Elders in the district praised his resilience, telling young men his story as proof that no failure is final. The boy who once had nowhere to sleep was now seen as an example of discipline and courage. For his aunt, it was unbearable. She used to spit insults at him, telling him he would never survive. Now those very words returned to her like echoes of shame. Neighbors reminded her of how she had laughed the night he left. Her sharp tongue, once feared, now only exposed her bitterness. She lowered her voice in public, afraid of hearing her own words repeated back to her. The cousins, once so proud and arrogant, found themselves shrinking in public. Children who used to boast that their father owned the compound now avoided eye contact when people asked about Adissa. They walked with their heads down, embarrassed that the same man they mocked was now providing the roof over their heads. Their friends teased them, saying, "So the landlord is your cousin?" They had no reply. Adissa did not chase these moments of shame. He didn't need to. Life itself carried his story like a trumpet. Everywhere he went, people looked at him with respect. He walked the same streets where he once begged for work, but this time he walked taller, not because of wealth alone, but because of the dignity he had earned. The tables had fully turned, and now everyone, even his family, was forced to see him as the man he had become. The courtyard was quiet that evening, the air thick with tension as Adissa stood before the family that once threw him out. 6 months earlier, they had given him 30 days to pack his things and disappear. Now he stood in the same compound, dressed in a crisp suit, holding documents that carried more weight than any insult. His aunt folded her arms, trying to look defiant, but her eyes betrayed her unease. His cousins leaned against the wall, restless and unsure. His uncle, once so loud and commanding, now sat nervously, sweat glistening on his forehead. Adissa's voice was calm but firm as he laid the papers on the table. "I am giving you 30 days, he said slowly, making sure each word sank deep. "Either you sign this lease contract and pay your rent on time, or you vacate the property completely." The silence that followed was heavy. His aunt gasped, one cousin muttered under his breath, and his uncle's face crumbled. For the first time, the man who had forced Adissa into the streets now found himself begging. "Please, Adissa, we are family," his uncle whispered, his voice shaking. Adissa looked at him, his expression steady. "I learned something on the streets," he replied. "Family is who stands with you, not who throws you out. You wanted me gone. But life brought me back, as your landlord." With that, he gathered his documents, turned toward the gate, and walked out. The sound of the metal gate slamming shut echoed across the courtyard, final and unshakable. The family stood frozen in silence, realizing the tables had turned forever, and Adissa had delivered the last word without raising his voice. It was the ultimate mic drop.